Greetings, everyone, and happy Wednesday to all of you. I hope that all is well. We're having some technical difficulties, so we're trying to make sure that everyone can see us. There we go. All right. We are all tonight, and our next fluctuate a little bit from Facebook to that will.
I think you're cutting out just a little bit there. But good evening, everyone. We're going to wait for Dr. Jeffery to get back in. I'm Natasha, Pierre. I'm with NAMI Hillsborough, and NAMI is the local affiliate for Hillsborough County of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We are the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization. And with me is someone that I'm delighted to see once again and to have tonight. I'll allow you to introduce yourself, Ernest. And you are on mute.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Ernest Hooper, former columnist with the Tampa Bay Times, now currently serving as the VP of Communications for United Way Suncoast. Also wear a couple of other hats, including hosting a public affairs show on WEDU PBS, and I've had the pleasure of having Natasha Pierre on my show. So it is great to see you again, and it's you know, mental health is an issue that I think we should always talk about. So I'm glad to join you tonight.
Thank you so much. We're talking about grief tonight. It's a topic that, believe it or not, you know, throughout this entire pandemic, the entire last year, we've spoken about a lot of things nationally, statewide, and locally. But despite how many people we've lost, grief hasn't been a topic that I think has been center stage enough. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think the pandemic combined with the racial awareness resurgence have been so dominant in the news that perhaps we have forgotten to talk about the actual loss of life. We've talked about how our lives have changed. We've talked about the fears with the pandemic. We've talked about the need first for testing and now for vaccinations. But it is so important to remember that so many of us have lost loved ones in our grief and are trying to carry on their life in this difficult challenge.
Absolutely. And, you know, at last count, I might be, you know, a couple thousand behind, but 565,000 people we've lost in the last year. And we've also lost people to the traditional reasons,
Yes.
You know, illnesses, accidents. We've lost a lot of people, and there's so many people that are grieving. Welcome back, Dr. Johnson. We're talking about grief and how the pandemic has dominated the media, in addition to the social and racial unrest or resurgence to the forefront that we saw last year. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why it's dominated the media. But it's important for us to take some time to talk about grief. And that's what we're here to do tonight.
Yeah, no doubt. You know, we've talked before, clearly a health crisis, also an economic crisis resulting from that health crisis. But we also have a mental health crisis, and grief is a big part of that. And grief is also something that I've spent a great deal of time focusing on, both in helping friends deal with grief and in dealing with my own grief.
And you're here tonight because you, as you mentioned, you've got your own journey with grief. What has been your story? What has been your journey? Tell us about what you bring to this grief discussion.
Well, I think unlike perhaps some others who may be listening this evening, my loss of life in my family has not been recent. I lost my father 20 years ago. I lost my mom 19 years ago. But I think it's germane to this discussion because I'm still in some ways dealing with that grief. And I always like to say, you never get over losing someone close to you like your parents. You learn to live with that loss. And I've learned to live with it, but there are days, there are most days I think I'm doing pretty well, but there are some days where that rush of emotions will come back, and I find myself grieving again and missing my mom and dad.
I think that's so important because many times people think that grief is linear and that it decreases over time. But to your point, it's just changing form. You deal with it and you're processing it differently, maybe from day one to day 595. But that doesn't mean that on day 620, you can't have another day five. And I think that's what you're sharing tonight.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there are seminal moments that you are enjoying and wishing that your parents could be there to see it. I think about my son's graduating from college. I think about my daughter uh, going to prom. Both of my parents were educators. I think about how proud they would be of my middle son, who is a grade school teacher. So when you reflect in that manner, that's when those emotions can come back. I wish they were here to see this. I wish they had lived long enough to have the kind of pride that I'm experiencing in this moment.
Well, I have a question for you and Dr. Johnson,
Okay.
because both of you have dealt with grief. Tell us about dealing with grief when you are a public figure, when you are a leader, when there are people looking up to you and depending on you. How do you navigate grief when sometimes it may feel like you don't have time to grieve?
Ernest, I'll let you go because I have a follow-up question to that. That's going to be a little bit probing. I had a hard time getting into the conversation in the beginning. So I'll come back with that. So Ernest, you want to answer that question first about how do you, I didn't give a proper introduction to everyone. I'm not for sure if you guys had a chance to do that.
You did.
Okay. All right. So Ernest, I'll allow you to answer that question from Natasha.
Well, I think as a columnist, there were a couple of moments when I had to write about losing someone. I lost my grandmother, who had kind of risen to fame, and I also wrote about losing my mom when I was a columnist. And I think, in those moments, as with all moments as a journalist, it's so important to be authentic and to talk about your feelings. And for me, I always found it cathartic, but I'm a writer naturally. So writing about my emotions is how I often deal with those mental collisions inside my heart and mind. Writing about it helps me untangle those emotions and not only understand what I'm feeling, but why I'm feeling it and what I can do to process those feelings and deal with them in a healthy way. So it wasn't being a public figure. I think Natasha actually helped me deal with some of the losses in my life.
I think for me, it was a conversation starter for those that were in my circle and those that were part of my life and the community. And it allowed an embracing factor of others to share with me their stories of losing a parent. What is it like to walk through pain? And what is it like to experience the hurt in front of other people? It's very difficult to grieve in front of people. Because at that time, of course, I'm pastoring and there are people that are following me. They're looking at how I lead by example. But I think the greatest piece for me was I had to be transparent in a moment. The moment of transparency was I'm hurting. And it's difficult when persons are waiting for you to listen to your words and to hear what you have to say. It's just a eye-opening moment that I'm able to be transparent. And then, for persons to see me as a pastor, pastor is human as well, he cries as well. At that time, my church, when my mother passed, many of them gathered around me and they drove to Jacksonville to the funeral. So I was able to see that and be a part of them sharing that time with me. So that was for me. And then we're going to bring in Tiffany. Tiffany lost her mother some years ago and had the opportunity to do her mother's service. And so we're going to bring her in, how she's dealing with that years later. But Ernest, I wanted to pick up on something, and others may definitely need to hear this. How did you deal with losing a parent, both parents within a year from each other? That's what I pretty much heard. 20 years ago for your father, 19 years ago for your mother. That's a lot to deal with, because I'm still dealing with the ravishing effects of losing my father. And now I turn around and I have to lose my mother. Could you talk to us about that for those that may be in a place to where they lost multiple loved ones periodically behind each other? I know Natasha talked about that a couple of weeks ago, about how many deaths that she experienced in the course of a few years. So talk to us about that tonight, Ernest, about how did you deal with that, or how are you dealing with that when you've had to deal with one challenge after another?
Yeah, I think it can be more challenging with that second parent or that second relative. But I also think it's important to recognize that how you grieve is probably going to be a little different depending on who you're grieving over. At least that was my experience. My father's death, he had been ill for a while, so it didn't come as a complete shock. But, when I lost my mom, practically 12, I'd say 14 months later, that was more challenging because I felt untethered. I'd lost both my parents, my connection to my heritage, to my ancestry, if you will. And, the second one was more difficult, but I rallied with my siblings and we leaned on each other, and I leaned on my wife, and all of that was part of the process of getting through it. And Dr. Johnson, initially on that day my mom passed away, I busied myself. We've found her in her home in Tallahassee. She had passed away, and it was very early in the morning. And in those early morning hours, I started cleaning up. And I remember cleaning out the refrigerator. And my younger sister was there, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, I'm fine. I'm doing what your mother would want me to do, which was get the house ready because people are coming over. That would have been my mom, kind of practical, kind of stoic. And so, I drew upon her personality in that moment.
That's interesting. I think we channel, and this is not to be a super spiritual thing, but we start thinking about the personalities of those that we've lost in those moments and say, what would they do, and how would they process this? Tiffany, it's been some years for you. Talk to us about how you're managing the grief and the passing of your mother, because I believe that you're the oldest child and you have siblings under you that's kind of watching you. And then even, guys, I want you guys, Tiffany has a brother in which was a teenager or child, a pre-adolescent teen, I believe, when their mom died. And so she took on the custody of her younger brother. There are a lot of people. So death brings on so many different dynamics. How did you deal with that, Tiffany?
I'm not gonna lie, it was tough. It's still tough. This year will be 10 years since she's passed. And my brother, he was 10 when she passed, and 2 years prior, he had lost his father when he was 8. So he, me being this, he came. I took him in along with my sisters as well because they were younger when our mother passed. So in essence, I at that time was newly married. I had just had a baby. My mom had passed, and then I had taken in all of her children. So I honestly didn't have time to grieve. So I still find myself day to day grieving because I never had that moment. I had to do everything with her services, things like that. It was really tough on me. Still a little tough, making sure my brother is going in the right direction. He's 21 now. Um, I pray daily. I pray for him more than myself. Because I don't know what it's like. I still have my father. I don't know what that is like. So I do pray for him daily.
Natasha, let's bring you back into the conversation. I think Tiffany brings up something great as well as Ernest in what he said. How do you process this, or give us some tools on how do you process this? Because you have responsibility on you. You have siblings, and you kind of keep going because you think this is what mom would want you to do, and this is what dad will want you to do. And a lot of times we don't stop and just say, I need to take care of me, because there's so many other responsibilities. There are so many other people that need the energy that I have and the family support that I have. What are some of the tools that we can take from this about how do we stop to focus on us while we're still helping to lead other people?
Some of the best advice ever spoken came from flight attendants. Secure your oxygen mask first before you secure any other person that you're traveling with. And many times when we're grieving and we have the responsibility, we're the firstborn, the oldest child, the go-to child, the CEO, the pastor, etc., all of the hats that we wear, many times we feel that we're exempt from care. We're exempt from love, we're exempt from grieving, we're exempt from taking a break, and that's simply not true. We've got to start with being honest about what we need and what we want. And sometimes we need that 1 hour, that 2 hour. We need some extra self-care. We need a day where we just get to sit, cry, process, go through photos, clean a refrigerator. We get to do whatever we need, because whatever we do to help us process, to help us put things in perspective and to make sense of the events is essentially not only going to help us, but is also going to help every person that we're in charge of, every person that we need to care for. So we begin with being honest, begin with recognizing that we have permission and we need to take some time to care for ourselves as well.
That's great to know. And so I'm interested to know, even those that are watching, how do you care for yourself in the process of grief? Today, I spoke to two individuals in particular about this. One young lady reached out to me about wanting to be a part of our conversation. She lost her husband last Thursday, so it hasn't been a week. And so persons are listening to our conversations and they're being encouraged by what we're doing. Someone else just called me or texted me and said, hey, I'm at the church. Is the session going on tonight? And I had to tell them that we're virtual tonight. So hopefully she's watching. And I'm looking at the comments, and Rashanti Jefferson, she's saying that the pain really doesn't go away. She said that she's in the comments. And then Gail Connor talks about losing her mother in 2008, her father in 2009. So Ernest, I think that opened up something as you shared about your parents passing and transitioning a year from each other, and then her brother in 2015 and her daughter in 2020. I think this is the beginning stage of us having these conversations to say, years later, Natasha, Ernest, Tiffany, I'm not okay. I'm processing it, but I'm still not okay, because there's still an empty place in this. And I often think about, even those that have gone through other things. My mother-in-law, she's lost 2 children. And so now my wife is the only child that's left. Or my wife can say, I've lost 2 siblings and I'm an only child. How do we process that? I guess the question that I want us to talk about now is, how do we remove those barriers to where we become comfortable a little bit to talk about how we really feel? What do we do to open up that conversation? So Natasha, we're going to start with you because you're kind of the expert here, and then we're going to turn to Ernest and then Tiffany. What are some of the things that we do to start the conversation to talk about how we really feel?
I think we're doing it tonight. We're having these courageous conversations. that I know that it is possible to be a leader and to be capable and strong and proficient in a professional sense, and to be actively grieving and hurt and in pain in a personal sense. And they're not mutually exclusive. I'm seeing that here tonight because I'm seeing three very capable people who are professional and successful in their own right. And for me, the message that's being sent is grieving and hurting and loss and pain does not make you weak. And so the more times people like us have these conversations, we're giving other people permission to say, yes, me too. Me too. I'm hurting too. I'm functioning 9 to 5. I'm doing everything I need to do during the day. And at night, I'm crying. And that it doesn't matter how long ago the loss was, a week, a month, 5 years, 20 years, 50 years. It doesn't matter. I keep saying that one of the ultimate expressions of being a loving human being is grief. You don't mourn for something that you didn't like or for someone that you didn't love. You're mourning for someone who actually left an imprint on your heart. And that, in my opinion, is one of the greatest signs of life. So we start by having these conversations unapologetically, unashamedly, open, honest, transparent, raw, and inviting others into the conversation to share their story. We may not have lost the same person or have lost in the same way, but we know what it feels like to grieve.
Yeah, I would follow that up by encouraging everyone to acknowledge their emotions. And perhaps you, don't need to express how you feel to everyone, but have those confidence, a pastor, a sibling, a dear friend who you can talk to about how you really feel. And some of your emotions are going to be raw. And from a faith perspective, you may be questioning, whatever higher power you believe in. You may be questioning your faith in God, in Jesus. And I remember being told by my pastor, that's okay. God has heard all those questions before. And just him saying that made me feel better about the doubts and the questions I was wrestling with. I think we find strength in knowing that others have experienced what we've experienced.
And for me, it was I had to teach myself to just live through the emotion. So that would be my advice. Just go through it. Like I would hear a song or I would have a memory and I would immediately scrap it. Like, I don't want to be sad. I don't want to cry. But now, honestly, my brother helped me with that. Every once in a while, he asked me, what was mom like? Or what did you do when you were little? And that kind of forced me to live through those memories, live through those emotions. So, now, okay, once or twice a week, I'll listen to a song she enjoyed, and I'm okay. So
Mhm.
just the biggest thing, just live through it. You'll get through it. Just live through it.
I like that. I
And
think, many times we focus on the event of the loss and we focus on the day. And I know many people remember the day and the date that someone has died, but that person had a lot of life prior to death. So, how can you celebrate their life? How can you remember their birthday, remember their favorite places, looking at pictures, their favorite movies? I think when we focus more on the life of the person that we lost, it takes some of the sting out of that day. And sometimes we need to create a new narrative that we're not just focusing on the events of when the person left our life, but we're celebrating the totality of who they were while we had them with us.
I think that's great. I would be interested to know how many persons, and not just us, and um, those that may even be watching, how many are able to admit and say, I still hurt because of this. I think we've been told to put on this facade, and it's not necessarily bad, to demonstrate that we're stronger than what we are. And so we feel as if we have to be this way. I have to be strong. I have to be tough as nails because persons are expecting this from me. But is it okay to say I'm still hurting? I am. I'm hurting. And let me bring this to be real, very real for me. One of my pastors died last Monday, and I shared this briefly last week. And so I've been working with the family to orchestrate this his celebration for this Saturday, and to make sure that things are well. It's really difficult to look at this because I'm like, I can't believe it. This really hurts. I can't believe it. And sometimes I look at the picture of my mother or my grandmother or other persons that have transitioned on, and I just say, man, this really hurts, you know? And I think that also opens up the conversation when we're able to say to other people, I'm still hurting. I'm not okay. There's still pain that I'm experiencing that I'm dealing with. Have you guys ever been to that place to where you're able to say to other people, I'm still hurting? You had to share that with those that are in your circle, your family. How did you guys deal with that? If you got to that realization to say, yes, I'm still hurting.
Yeah, for me, it was since November 6th, 2019, I've lost 8 people close to me. And the awareness for me was when, friends pointed out that I had with I withdrew. I was isolating myself. I wasn't communicating. I moved from St. Pete to Tampa. I I just wanted a change. And and the pandemic kind of helped me to cocoon and isolate myself and insulate myself with just my feelings. And it was having friends who are who love you enough to say, I notice that you are acting different. I notice that you've checked out. I notice that you are isolating. That was the first awareness for me. And I just had to be honest and say, you know what, I am not processing these deaths well. No one ever taught me how to grieve. No one ever taught me what to expect. No one ever taught me that, I could be fine for, a month and then I hear a song or I see a location or there's a cologne or something. And all of these memories come rushing back and then I'm boohooing on 275. No one ever said that to me. And so I am grateful that I have people in my life who can, speak to me at that level and say, hey, I notice what's going on. And I'm grateful that I was courageous and bold enough and took that opportunity to say, you know what? Nah, I'm not good. I'm dealing with this. I'm processing it. And I don't have a manual. There's no manual for grief. There's no, okay, you do these 5 things and then you're good. There's nothing like that. We feel our way through it. And as Tiffany says, we live with it, we process it, we face those feelings every single day until we learn new strategies for dealing with the pain and the loss.
And let me say this, and I'm so sorry. My internet connection keeps going in and out, and I'm sorry about that. And but Natasha, I think you bring up something great for us to even expound on. That we have persons in our circle that they're able to say, "I recognize that there is a difference in you." But how do we accept that, right? How do we accept from other people that we've changed? Are we open, Tiffany and Ernest? Did anyone ever say to you they see a change in you because of the grief that you're dealing with, that you're not yourself? And is that a moment for us to evaluate ourselves to say, well, perhaps I do need to process this. Perhaps I'm taking my emotions out on other people. I'm not handling this in a healthy way. I'm being a bit lethargic and unresponsive to the people that really love me and care for me. Did that ever happen to you in a moment of your life when you were handling your grief that someone said, you're not yourself? And they didn't mean that in a mean or demeaning way, but they just can tell that you're not yourself. Did that ever happen to either of you, that you weren't yourself as you were processing the passing of your parents in immediate time?
Yes, it did happen with me. And I will admit, I remember it full well. I, was dealing with the passing of my stepdad, and then, I was pregnant at that time, and then 2 years later, I'm dealing with the passing of my mother, and I was a grouch. It was pretty bad. I was mean. Because at that time, I didn't know how to deal with everything, having everyone under one roof, trying to take care of everything. Everything was on my back. I did not know how to deal with it. So I was grouchy and I was told I was pretty mean, but I didn't know what else to do. That's how I chose to deal with it at the moment, I suppose. But I eventually, started praying more, journaling more, and I got through that part. I got through the bad part.
Got it. Ernest, did that ever happen to you?
It didn't happen with me. I think because I was fortunate, not that I didn't go through different mood swings, but I was fortunate to have close friends and family who understood. Well, he is in a place right now, and he doesn't necessarily want to talk. And they would say to me, sincerely, when you're ready, let me know. When you need someone, if you need someone now, let me know. If not now, later. Just stay in touch, stay in contact, and let me know that you're okay. And sometimes, when we offer sympathy or condolences, sometimes there's not a lot that needs to be said. I think there are people who want to give all the right answers and say all the right things. But sometimes we just need you to call and say, hi, are you okay? And that's it. And I was fortunate to have some friends who were able to give me my space, if you will.
Space is so important. I think sometimes, and immediately after like the home going, the funeral service, there's a lot of people around. And after all of that is over, that's when people, go back to their own lives. And you're left with the silence, you're left with the stillness, you're left with the memories, you're left to process and think through all of it. And I am grateful for the people who still text, still call, still, pop in, just checking on you, need anything, how are you? Because the reality is sometimes we do need some stillness and some quiet to process and to think through everything. And I know tonight we're talking about loss of family members and loved ones, but there's also other forms of grief. In the last year, I've heard of people who are grieving that they lost their home, their dream home, the home that they worked so hard to get. They've lost that, or they've lost physical ability because of a diagnosis, or they lost a car. So there are many different and sometimes compounding layers of grief that people are dealing with that, we just need some time. We need some time with.
Well, yeah, and I think you mentioned that period after the funeral, after all of the repasts and all of that. To me, that was the more challenging part. It was those days and weeks after we celebrated my mother's life, and I couldn't busy myself anymore, Pastor. I couldn't find anything else left to do. And it was then I had to take the time, Natasha, to process and deal with my emotions. And I think in that first week or so leading up to the funeral, everyone thought I was fine. Oh, he's fine. He's laughing. He's telling stories about his mom. And I was fine. I was surrounded by loved ones. It's that I guess I'd call it the post-funeral period that can be one of the most challenging, I think.
It's like when we escape the fog of it all, if we will, because when a transition happens and a death happens, there's a fog there because there's so many things that we need to do. And it's almost as if we step out of a trance, out of reality, because we have funeral arrangements and so many different things that are in front of us. And as Ernest said, after that is all over, after the celebration services of life, after the phone calls even stop, I'm now face with what's really going on, right? So I think that's the fog of life. And so once that fog leaves, once that mirage leaves, now we are confronted with, I'm by myself. This is a voice that I would never hear again. And I heard the conversation earlier that grieving does not only stop with someone that has transitioned from life, they have given up breath. But if you've lost anything, a home, a car, a pet, a job, whatever that may be, there's so many different ways in which we have to process life after that fog, after that, that smoke screen has left. And I want to acknowledge something that's in the comments, and I want to make sure that we're reading this. Gail says, I've never really had time to grieve before another death. And my brother, and on top, I had to make another decision for my father and my brother. Mom hadn't made a decision in a living will, and siblings not being involved. That I'm trying to make sure I get this. And then she said, fighting and making those decisions of 2016. My husband coded twice after going through all of that hurt, anger, stress. I had to get help. I was responsible for everyone. So the question is, am I really responsible for everyone, or do I take on that responsibility of being responsible for everyone because I've carried this load of responsibility? Right. So what a part of this, Natasha, let's go back to what Gail has said. What of this that I have to give back to, take some of this off of me? I cannot be responsible for everyone else. I think you made the analogy how flight attendants say it best, that you have to secure your own safety seating first before you can help someone else. We carry that unnecessary burden at times because we feel, based on what we've done in times past, we carry this level of responsibility. But at what point do we say, I can't be responsible for everyone else because I have to look after me?
There's an adjacent conversation to this about our ability to ask for help. And many times, especially if you are a high achiever, if you are that capable, responsible child person, you do not want to ask for help. And sometimes we need to ask. Sometimes we got to say, you know what? I need a break. I can't deal with this right now. I need you to handle this. I need some time for myself. I need to process. It's challenging to do if you've never done it before, if you have a hard time doing it, or if you've always been that go-to child that handles everything. But there is a component of self-love and self-care embedded in asking for help. And think about it. I love when people ask me for help. That means that they trust me. They know that, I'm capable. I'm going to get it done. Why would we refuse to give someone else the opportunity to experience that same joy, to experience the opportunity to say, you know what, I came through for Gail. I came through for Ernest. I came through for Tiffany. I came through for Dr. Johnson. I was there for Natasha. We need to trust that someone else wants to be with us and stand with us in what is pain. What Gail has experienced is just, unspeakable. And sometimes, I felt like I didn't have time to fully take a deep inhale or a deep exhale because the weight of the grief was just too much. That if I let out even a little bit, I don't know if I would have time to, be back on and handle everything I needed to do. And so sometimes we need to take some things off of our plate. And many times that means asking for help. It really does.
That's powerful. And I would say this, and I'm fortunate that most of the persons that I see comments, and even bringing Ernest on today, and Tiffany. Ernest is a colleague at work. Tiffany is a former administrator at our church, and Gail is an aunt, my wife's aunt. So we don't do in-laws. So she's my aunt now. One thing in particular, and I'll just say this, and I can't tell Gail's story. I would love to get her and my mother-in-law on in the next couple of weeks, because we only have a couple of weeks to go. And the reason why I say this is because last year, Gail's daughter was murdered. And can you imagine losing a child and they are 2,000 miles away? And you're already dealing with the grief from the other loss that still seem to be so fresh. And then you get the call that because your child is so far away that you have to fly up immediately to identify the body. I can't imagine that. I cannot imagine that because it was so traumatic. And I can only imagine that for Gail, Ernest, Tiffany, Natasha, it was traumatic for me because the day in which we were celebrating my graduation with my PhD and we get the phone call, going to a restaurant with our family and friends, and my wife just starts crying profusely. What's going on? In January of 2020. I can't imagine that. So I can't imagine that piece with Gail. So I would love to have her to come on in a couple of weeks to talk about that. And this question comes to us unless you guys had an opportunity to be by the side of your loved ones when they transitioned. How was it for you when you got the call? I'm never sure what happened to you, Ernest or Tiffany or Natasha, with your loved ones. How did you handle and manage the call when your loved one, someone said to you, your loved one has passed away? How did you manage that?
For two of them, I had an event the next morning. For another one, I found out 5 minutes before going live on TV. And in the moment, I am grateful that I was able to see my strength, that I was able to, in the moment, do the job that needed to be done and seemingly postpone grief for a moment to get through the assignment. But it was tough, and it's still tough. And sometimes people want to put a hierarchy on grief. Well, if you knew they were dying, then you shouldn't grieve as much. Versus if it was something sudden, then you're grieving a lot.
Wait a minute. I gotta stop you. Let's go back to talk about how people tell you how to process grief. I just had to stop you right there because people will say, well, you knew that they were transitioning. You knew that they were dying. You should be taking this better than what you are. Are you serious? As
you
if
had
I
time.
Don't hurt. Yeah. Okay.
You had time to deal with the loss. You had time. You knew that this was coming. So I kind of figured you'd handle it better versus a sudden loss. Grief is grief is grief is grief. And it is so intimate and personal to the person that's experiencing it. And this is my call for empathy, for compassion, for kindness, for respect, for what a person is experiencing, especially when someone has lost parents, plural. There is almost a feeling of being an orphan, of neglect, that no matter what age they are, that's what they feel. And that's something that they have to process, they have to make sense of, they have to mourn and grieve. And it's insensitive to cast our judgment on, well, I thought you'd be over it. I thought you would have been able to handle it. That's insensitive. That's not being a good human. Being a good human means I stand with you, I sit with you. I may not understand why you're grieving or feel the intensity of your grief, but I care that you hurt. So I'm here. What do you need me to do? That's it.
Yeah,
go ahead. Yep.
I think everyone grieves differently, and that's so important to remember. And they say you only get one chance to make a first impression. When you're dealing with someone who has lost a loved one, you may only get one chance to show that person that they can count on you. And you do that. You take advantage of that one opportunity by listening and empathizing and reserving your judgment. And again, I don't think you need to say a whole lot. I think the most important thing you can do is just listen and let that person talk about how they feel and what they're experiencing. I think listening is so much more important than trying to find that combination of consoling words that's going to help the person feel better. They may not want to feel better. They may want to be sad. Let them be sad.
Right.
Let them talk about their sadness.
Yeah, that's great. And Tiffany, we're going to bring you in on this conversation because I think persons feel as if they have to say something to make you feel better. that listening sometimes is the last thing that people do when it should be the first. They feel as if, and this is unbeknownst to them, and is no castration, because persons mean well, so they think that they have to come and say something. They have to say something that they think that is going to make you feel better. Well, God needed, another flower in his garden. No, he didn't. Or God needed another angel. No, he didn't. So we say these things because we've heard others say this to them in their moments of grief. So they think they're supposed to say this to you, and they're doing damage. Tiffany, jump in on that.
I just laugh because when my mom passed, I got a lot of stares, a lot of I don't know what to say, but I'm like, you don't have to say anything, it's fine. And I was constantly saying, you don't have to say anything, you don't have to say anything. But I don't understand why people feel they have to say something or that it will help, because it does not. It doesn't help. And if I hear time heals all wounds one more time, because it doesn't.
I think that's in the chat box. What are those trigger words to your grief? People say that. What are some of the things that you've heard? Time heal all wounds, or God needed them and He knew best, and and what are some of the things that have been said to you about grief, and what person said to you that they thought they were helping you with, and it didn't help the situation? What are some of the things that you've heard?
God
Well,
needed
she's not
another
hurting
angel.
anymore.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Jump in.
No, I used to hear, well, at least she's not hurting anymore. She's in a better place. It's like, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear with me.
Got it. Yeah.
God wanted another angel. God needed a soldier. Their purpose, they fulfilled their purpose. Their time was up. When one child is born, someone dies. I mean, it's all these cliche things, and they're said because we're really not comfortable talking about death. We're not comfortable talking about death or grieving or any of those seemingly negative emotions and feelings. We're not comfortable with it. And that's why people are searching and clutching in the air and pulling things out of the sky to say, because they're uncomfortable just sitting in silence. They're uncomfortable just being present. And, I put in the chat, sometimes less is more. Sometimes you don't have to say anything besides, I'm here. And if you can't remember that, just stand or sit next to the person. They'll feel your presence. Your heart can communicate more and better than your mouth can. And you don't have to say anything. Definitely not a cliche, because it does, in my opinion, more harm than good.
Ernest, anything you want to say about that?
There were times in the days after my father's death, in the days after my mom's death, where I was sad, but I ended up with friends and family sharing funny stories about the person who had gone and laughing. I feel like I laughed as much, if not more, during those times of grieving than I did in any other chapter of my life. And so I think it's important to remember being present is so important, Natasha. And sometimes just being there and allowing me to share whatever emotions I may be experiencing, whether it's sadness or whether it is a celebrating, as you said, that person's life and remembering the great things, the funny things that they did. It all helps. That presence is what's needed most.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're bringing the conversation to an end, and I am so grateful for Mr. Hooper and for Tiffany and for Natasha. We sat down maybe a couple of months ago and talked about, how do we have this organic conversation, and let's bring others in. And so I'm grateful for that. And I would say this in conclusion. I'm going to give all of you an opportunity to say final words as we conclude. But I would say for my mom, one of the things that we do to remember her is that we remember some of her favorite music. One of my mom's favorite songs was, there's an artist back in the 70s, and she recently passed away, called Betty Wright. She wrote After the Pain and stuff like that. And, there's a song in which Betty Wright says, don't blame Mr. Charlie. Mr. Charlie is just a man. He's doing the best he can. And then she hit some high notes. And so when my family gets together, we're from Jacksonville, so we love doing crab boils and things of that nature and playing music. So we listen to the music and somebody would say, this is what mom would say. And then we'll start singing like she would. And that just brings joy into the room, because it helps the process when you're around other people who can help you respond and feel the emotions of the person that is no longer here. It kind of takes the weight off a little bit. So I will go with Ernest and then Tiffany and Natasha. Give us some parting words for those that are watching and listening tonight.
Well, Dr. Johnson, I just want to thank you for having this series, and I look forward to listening in and continuing to hear what others have to say. And I really want to hear people talk about losing their kids. That's not something I've experienced. And to me, that could be an entire episode unto itself, because it is unimaginable. Once you become an adult, you do begin to at least think about that day where you might have to bury your mother or father. You really don't think about that with your kids. And so I look forward to hearing more of this conversation and learning how people have dealt with that kind of loss, because I know it can be painful.
Thank you for that. And Gail has mentioned that in the chat that she'll be happy to be on the Zoom. She lost her daughter. And so that's a great point. Thank you, Ernest, for bringing that back up. Tiffany.
To start, I want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I did enjoy being in the space and getting to speak about grief. One thing my siblings and I have started doing, we do a balloon release on our mother's birthday. And we also get together once a week, have dinner, games. We just want to keep the children together. We promised each other we would stay close. So that did help us in that space. Every once in a while, we, talk about memories and things like that, but we mostly just enjoy getting together.
Good. That's a good process. Natasha.
Grief is human. We're not going to escape this life without experiencing any loss. And so it's time for us to talk about it and stop pretending that it's not happening. Stop pretending that we're not hurting. And, an adjacent conversation to this would be, grief when it's compounded. Grief when there are circumstances surrounding the loss of a loved one, sibling issues, challenges, money issues, family breaks apart. Sometimes that compounds the grief. How do you get to healing? How do you get to forgiveness? And that's something I'll lean on you, Dr. Johnson, for. But again, thank you for creating the space for us to have this necessary conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you for those who've watched tonight. We've seen our numbers go up and down, had some Wi-Fi issues, but we made it through it. And so grateful. Please be sure to share this video on your social media platforms, whether it is YouTube or Facebook. Copy the link and send it to someone that may just need to hear others have a moment of transparency to talk about the hurt that they've experienced and what they're doing to process it. None of us are saying that we are professionals or we have all of the answers, but what we are saying is we understand. And when you share the space of understanding, you build compassion. That is the foundation in which we stand on, that I sympathize with you. I understand what you are experiencing because I've walked in those shoes. And so we are that segment to help others pass through this channel of life of hurt by having an organic conversation. So thank you tonight for each and every one of you that has watched. Panel, don't go anywhere. The rest of you, we'll see you next week, Wednesday night, same bat time, same bat channel, 6:00 p.m. next Wednesday for our second to last series dealing with grief and bereavement. Thank you so much.